Guys, how's it going? My name is Valerie and welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about three fundamental concepts in React. I want to talk about React state, props, and prop types. And the reason why I want to talk about these things is because I know that for people who are just getting started learning React, these concepts often serve as a huge point of confusion. I know for me, when I started learning React, even after having used these things in a project, I was still unclear with how they worked and what the point of them was within the greater React ecosystem. I had a very hard time understanding the difference between React props and state and what was the point of prop types. So if you're a beginner with React and you're looking for more clarity on any one of these concepts, or maybe all of these concepts, or maybe you're familiar with React and you just wanted a little refresher, join me in the next section of this video where I'll basically break things down in greater detail for you, and I'll walk you through some examples and use cases for each of these concepts. All right, guys, so we are ready to get started with this beginner React tutorial. We're going to be getting started with React props. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new React project on our command line. So if you navigate into your command line, you should be able to get a project going. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the create React app command to set up our React project. So that's going to be the following command. And we'll call this project React Basics. Call this React Basics 1. So give that a few minutes to run its course. Typically takes a little bit of time. I'll pause this video and resume it in a moment. All right, guys, so our project is now ready to get up and running. So when you're starting a new React project, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that everything is working normally. So right now we have a boilerplate project that's ready to go. And what we're going to do is cd into our React project, React Basics 1. And once we do that, we're going to open it in our code editor of choice. The code editor I'll be using is Visual Studio Code. So the command to open that one up is code space dot. And when we press enter, that'll open up for us here. And then the next thing you want to do is run the dev server start script. So that's going to be npm start. And that should open up the boilerplate project in our browser. So just give that a few seconds. And there we go. So we know now that everything's running pretty normally. So we're pretty much good to get started. And what we're going to want to do first is just get our boilerplate out of the way so that we can start building our project from scratch. So what we're going to do first is we're going to delete our app CSS file because we don't need that for this project. And then we're going to delete our index CSS as well. And we'll go into our index.js and we'll just get rid of a couple lines. So we'll get rid of our index CSS import. And that should be it there. We'll save that. We'll get rid of our logo SVG as well. Move that out. And then we'll get rid of our index CSS. And then in our app.js file, we're going to get rid of all of that boilerplate. So everything in between the opening and closing div tags. We're just going to get rid of that. And we'll take away our class name as well because we're not really working with style sheets in this project. And then we'll get rid of our logo import and our app CSS import, and then we'll save. So that should now clear our starter project of all the clutter. And if we go back into our browser, we should see a blank slate. So that's where we want to start. right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our first component. Now, for the purposes of this tutorial, I am only going to be working with functional components in React. The reason is because the community is starting to lean more towards functional components for development. So we're going to be working primarily with functional components, which will allow us to practice a lot of the utilities that work alongside functional components. So what we're going to do first is we're going to create a new file. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you have the option of clicking this icon up here to create a new file. And we're going to call this new file reactprops.js. Now, when we're in a new file in React and we're creating a new component, the very first thing we want to make sure we do is import React from the React library. This gives us access to React's utilities and allows us to create components and things like that. Next, what we're going to do is create our functional components. So functional components in React are just basic JavaScript functions. What they do is they have the option of taking in arguments, and then they typically return some JSX. Functional components in React are considered stateless. However, we do have the option of adding state to a functional component through the use of hooks. So for the purposes of the prop section of this tutorial, we won't really be working with state, but we will get to see how that works in the next section. For now, what we're going to do is return just some basic JSX in the form of opening and closing div tags. And in between those div tags, we're going to create an H1, and then we'll just say something like, this is my props component. And then we'll save that. So when we do save that, we won't see that appear just yet in our browser. Reason being is that in order for our browser to properly render what we've created here, we will need to have that pass through our root component. So in this case, our root component is the app.js component. This will also serve as our primary and only parent component. In the case of React, data flows in one direction. It flows down from our parent to our child, and we'll be demonstrating that with these examples. So before we get into anything, what I want to do is import our React props from React props, and then we'll save that. And then the next thing we want to make sure we do is also export it from its file. So export default React props. So now that we've imported React props, we can now utilize it within our root component. So in between these div tags, I'm going to just render the React props component. And the way we do that is we just take the name of the component and we put it in a self-closing tag, just like that. So now we can go ahead and have a look in our browser, and we'll see here, I'm actually going to minimize this. There we go. And we'll see here that our component is rendering the way it should be in our browser, just like that. So this is our H1 tag that is coming from our React props component. Another way you can actually check this, and I'm going to just give myself a bit of space here so we can see. Another way you can check this is if you go into the inspect element or DevTools, and you can go into the body tags, and where you see a div ID of root, that represents your root component in React. So if we go into our index.js file here, we can actually see that the ID of root is what is being fetched here in order to render our root component. So basically, what we see here is being represented by the structure of our React application. When we open up this section, we go a little bit deeper in, we'll eventually get to the H1 tags that are being rendered in the browser. And this is coming from our child component, React props. So that's just one way you can kind of keep track of what's going on within your component. We'll keep this open for future reference. And the next thing we're going to want to do is start adding props into our application. So props in React can often cause a lot of confusion for developers, especially when you're a beginner. Basically, what props are is they are properties that we can set within our application. The props object exists in React as a utility that allows us to have access to properties that we control. So if you decide you want to add a name prop, a date prop, an age prop, you can set those within your components, and those props can then be passed from your parent down to your child. So I'm going to show you how that works. So in between these brackets as your argument, you're going to pass in props. And now what we've done is we've added access to the props object from our component. So now our component can access information that is set from our parent, and this information can be displayed within our component. So let's see how that looks. If we go underneath our H1, we're going to create an H2. And in between curly braces, we can set a title prop. And then underneath that, I'll set an H3, and this can be, we'll set this as a name prop. And then between H4s, we can set an age prop. Oops. Just like that. Now, when I save that, it's going to error out because this syntax is incorrect. Since we're accessing these properties from this props object, we need to denote props dot. And that's where React will understand where these properties are coming from. So when we save that, things go back to normal. Now what we want to make sure we do is we need to actually provide the information that's being passed into this child component. So what that looks like is we need to go into our parent, in this case our app.js file, and now what we need to do is set a title, and we can set that to a basic string. This will just be hard-coded information. This is my title prop. And then we can set a name equal to, I'll set this equal to my own name. And then we can set an age prop, and we'll just set this equal to a number. So you see here now we have the title prop, we have the name prop, and we have the age prop all being rendered within our browser. And the reason for that is because we've passed that information down to our React props component. So this parent has now passed information down, and we're able to render that information in our browser because we've gone into our child and we've explicitly rendered it in between the corresponding tags. Now, if we go back into our dev tools here, we open up the elements and we go in, and eventually we'll get down to the level where our child is being rendered. This now we can see our H1, we can see the H2 prop, the H3 prop, and then the H4 prop that we passed down from our app.js component. Now, there are a few different ways we can use props in terms of syntax. This is one of the basic syntax of the props object. You basically pass in your props object as an argument, and then from that props object, you pull the properties that have been passed down from your parent: title, name, and age. Now, if I wanted to get a little deeper and instead use ES6 syntax, I do have the option of destructuring. So I can go just above my return statement, and I can set a const of destructured props. So in this case, title, name, age. And I can set that equal to the props object. So this basically means that I'm pulling out these properties from the props object as a form of destructuring. So once we do that and we save, we can actually get rid of this props dot and just utilize the name of the property directly. And this makes things a little easier for us. And it also looks a little cleaner. You're not seeing props dot, props dot, props dot being repeated constantly. You're just seeing the names of your properties directly. And notice how nothing has changed in our browser because it means the exact same thing. Now we also have another option with syntax and destructuring in ES6. We can actually copy this. We can pull that out and replace the props object with the destructured properties. Just close that there. And then we can get rid of this entirely. And when we save that, nothing changes because it means the exact same thing once again. So destructuring the properties that you need directly as an argument works just as well as passing in your props object as an argument. One reason why this might be useful for anyone is because with our props, oftentimes we may be passing down a huge number of different properties. And in a given child component, what if you only want to use 3 out of the maybe 10 props that you've passed from that parent? If you're only looking to use the 3, you can pass these 3 as destructured properties without having to work with the entire props object of all the other properties that may not be useful to this component. So that's why ES6 destructuring is incredibly useful, and it is also something to get used to, because if you're working with a project and you do see destructuring syntax being used, it is incredibly helpful to understand what that destructuring means and what it's doing within your component. So one last thing I do want to show you guys with respect to props in React is what the props object actually looks like in our console. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm actually going to go back to passing the props object as a whole, and then we'll just go back to the initial syntax that we had from before. I'll just add those in. And then if I go above our return statement, I'm just going to log to the console the props object. And if we go into the console, we'll actually see our props object being displayed. So notice here how we have a title, a name, and an age, all showing with their respective values. And remember, these values are coming from our main app component. The title is set to "This is my title prop," the name is set to Valerie, and the age is set to 15. When we open that up, we just see the greater detail here. So dev tools are very useful for understanding and for visualizing your data in React. And I do recommend utilizing them as much as you can. If you need to console log information to understand more of what it's doing, that can really help you in your development. So that pretty much is it for the props section of this tutorial. Just remember that props are information that are passed around in React, and they flow in one direction. They flow downward from your parent to your child, and props in React allow us to utilize information and data within our React components. One thing that's important to understand about props is that they are read only. So we're not able to directly modify or edit props within our React components. That is where state comes in. So whenever you're utilizing props, just understand that they cannot be modified directly, but they are still very useful because it gives us a way to handle data that is very intuitive and easy to understand. For example, if you are using a third-party API, maybe something like a headless CMS, and you're making a call to that CMS to consume data within your React component, this data that you end up consuming can be in the form of props, which again are read-only, but you can still modify that information from your headless CMS and make an additional call to retrieve the updated information and display that as props within your React component. So that's just one typical use case for props in React. There are numerous others, and of course React is a very flexible library, so there are many, many more that many of us may not even know just yet, but there's a whole world out there to discover. So definitely understanding props at its most basic level will help you to develop into a more advanced developer. So what we're going to look at next is state in React, and we're going to be using functional components once again. So this will allow us to leverage the use of the useState hook. All right, guys, so just to summarize what we have done so far we've had a look at React props at a very basic level. We've understood how props are passed from our parent down to our child, and we've just been working with hard-coded data to understand how props work within the React ecosystem. So the next thing we're going to be looking at is state in React. And what we're going to do to understand this is we're going to create another file called, let me just create this file here. We're going to create a file called react state.js. And we're going to go through the same motions we did when we created our React props component. And first we're going to import React from React. And then the next thing we're going to do is create our component. So this is going to be a functional component once again. And this is going to be called React State. And we're just going to return again a set of div tags. Oops, spelling is wrong there. In between these div tags, we're going to do another h1, and we'll say this is my state component. And then what we want to make sure we do is export this component. And then what we'll do is go into our main app component and we will import it. Now we're ready to render this component within our root. So we'll just do the same thing we did last time. And it's really important to get used to these motions because this is the flow of any React application. All right, so now we're ready to continue. We're going to go into our React state component. And now what we're going to do is learn about the useState hook in React. So the useState hook is basically a way of adding state to our otherwise stateless or functional components. The thing with functional components is that they allow us the use of hooks so that we can hook into other types of functionality that are available to us with the use of functional components. And this is what makes functional components so powerful and oftentimes preferable for React developers. So the way we can make use of the useState hook is what we need to do is first import it. So on the same line as our React import, we're just going to add an additional item, and that is going to be useState. And this comes from the React library as well. Then what we're going to do is create some extra space for ourselves, and we're going to create our first piece of state. This piece of state will be something you've probably seen before if you've watched other React tutorials. This is going to just be a basic counter. So what we'll do is we'll set a constant, and in an array we're going to provide two variables. The first one is going to be a variable called count. The second one is actually going to be a function called setCount, and we're going to set that equal to the useState hook, and as an argument, we're going to pass in a 0 for now. And this is basically the way in which we make use of our useState hook. We have to have our initial state variable, and then we need to have a function that will update that initial state to be some other state. So this is the pattern that you're going to often see when the useState hook is being used in a functional component. This argument here, the 0, represents the initial state of our useState variable. So count, being the variable or the initial state variable, is being set to 0 at the beginning as its initial state. Once we decide to do something with this setCount, that is going to be the function that updates the 0 to become something else. So we're going to get to see that in action. And the first thing we're going to want to do is create an element that's going to be responsible for the event handler that will manage the state. So we're just going to use a basic button, and this button is going to be called click me. and that click me appears there, but it doesn't do anything just yet. Now what we want to do is we're going to create a function that will be used with our event handler to update the state of our count variable. So the way that looks is we have the option of doing it inline, and that's what we're going to do as the first option, just so that I can show you guys what it means to invoke a function in the same line as your JSX. So we're going to use the onClick handler, and we're going to set that to be a function, and that function will be the setCount function. And we're going to pass in, and so our setCount function will basically take our count variable and add 1 to it each time this button is clicked. So when we save that, what we've done here is we've taken a basic button element and we've added an event handler, which is basically our setCount function that will add 1 to our count variable. So the expected behavior in this case is our initial state should be updated or incremented by 1 each time we click this button. So the next thing we want to make sure we do is actually see that in action. So we're going to just add a paragraph underneath, set of paragraph tags, and in between these paragraph tags we will display our count variable. So notice here how a count of 0 is rendering in our browser, and the reason for that is because that represents the initial state. On every page refresh, the state of our React components goes back to their initial state. So when we click this, then we'll see the increment happening as many times as we click. And when we refresh, that state goes back to 0. Now, if we wanted to go back into this use state hook and pass in, let's say, a 12 instead, then notice here how in our browser we start at 12, because that is what the initial state has been set to. And when we click, it just adds 1 to 12, and it keeps going as many times as we click. So this initial state can be set to whatever we choose. And when we do set that initial state, that is the value that will be stored in our count variable or in our initial state variable. And the function that updates that state has to have some sort of functionality hooked into it to make sure that that variable gets updated each time we interact with our component. Now, clicks are not the only way in which we can interact with a React component. We have other options for other event handlers as well, and we also have options for API calls. When an API call is made and we fetch data to be brought into our React component, that is also another way that we can manage our state. We can update state based on the types of data that we receive within our component. So there is a lot of different ways in which we can make use of state management within our React components, but this is of course just a very basic example. Now I'm going to show you guys another way we can work with state in our component. And we're going to create a second piece of state, and this will deal with a text color. So we'll call this const, and text color will represent our initial state variable, and then we'll add a function called set text color, and we'll set this equal to our use state hook, and as an argument we will pass in a string, and this string will be red. The next thing we want to do is create another button that will handle the interactivity of our click. So we'll go underneath our paragraph tags here and we'll create a button similar to how we did last time. And this button will be called change text color. Now underneath that button, we will add a set of p tags, and we'll just say something like this is a basic line of text. And that's where we get our simple line of paragraph text underneath our button. And again, this button's not going to do anything until we hook up some sort of functionality to it. So now, what I want to show you guys is another type of syntax that we can use to create event handlers. So above our return statement, we can create a function called const change text color. And in the body of this function, we can make use of our set text color function, which will be responsible for updating our state. And we'll move that in here, and we will pass a string of green. So what we're doing now is the set text color state updater function will receive green as the updated color of our text. So we start off with a color of red and will be updated to a color of green on every button click when this change text color function is being invoked. So what we'll do down here in our button is we'll add an on-click event handler, and we will set that to our change text color function, which we will paste here. So what we're now doing is we're passing in a reference to the function rather than invoking the function immediately the way we did it here. So what will happen is on every click, this reference will point to this function and it will run the code inside of it. So I'll just save that. Now the next thing we want to do, we're not quite done yet, is we want to go into this paragraph and we want to add an inline style. So the way we do that in React is we use the keyword style, and we set that to a set of curly braces to represent the fact that we are embedding non-JSX type code into our JSX, and then a second set of curly braces representing the style object. The way styles work in React is that they are utilized in the form of objects, so we always need two sets of curly braces when we're working with inline styling. So now what we want to do is set our color property of this style, and the value of that color property will be our text color variable. So when I paste that and save it, you'll notice here that the line of text now goes from black to red because the initial state is what we've set at red. So text color is equal to red to begin, and when we click, it will go to green. So this button click basically means that we have invoked this changed text color function, which will update the initial state to be green instead of red. Now, because we don't have any sort of toggle set up with this event handler, we can only change the text color on one click. So when I refresh, it does go back to red, and then if I click again, it goes back to green. And that just represents one click that allows us to change that color. Now, if we added more functionality or more options to this event, then we could click multiple times and see multiple things happen. But for now, we just have the ability to do it once. All right, so there's one last thing I wanted to show you guys. This is going to be similar to what we just did with the line of text, but just another example of how we can use the use state hook. So I'm going to actually copy this and I'm going to paste it real quick. And instead of text color, we're going to call this background color. And then we'll call this set background color. Let me just get rid of that. And then we will set this equal to gray. And now what we'll do is we'll add an additional button. And this will be responsible for changing our background color. And up here as the div, we're going to set the entire div to be a certain background color. So that's going to be style equals background color of background color. And notice here how this entire div's background now changes to gray. And in order to create a function that'll update the state of this background color, we can actually copy and paste this. And this will be called change background color. And we'll set our background color to be yellow. So now what we can do is add our event handler, and that will be, once again, a reference to this function. And we will save that and try it out. And there you go. So on this click, the React component recognizes that it is now going to update the state from being gray to yellow, and that's what it does there. Once again, we can't do it more than once, but this is just a simple example of how you can hook state up to your React component to change styles, to change numbers, to change all sorts of things. These are just very simple examples, but you can also leverage this type of functionality to create more complex state management within your React applications. It's important to remember that state is the way we manage changes in our React components. So anything that you want to update within your component, you will have to sort of consider to yourself, is this something that I'll need to use state for? If it's something that changes, most likely the answer is yes. If it's something that you can display as simple read-only data, then that's when you can consider using props instead of state. Now, the way props and state kind of work together is that props are information that we pass around from parent to child, but state is our way of updating that prop or that information that we're passing around. So oftentimes there is a confusion between props and state because they are used in conjunction with one another, but they are also responsible for different things. Props handle the data within our application. State handles the changes to that data within our application. So anytime we need to experience a change within our React application, think state. But whenever we're just simply passing that data around and displaying it in our React application, think props. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. The next thing we're going to be looking at is how we work with prop types in our React application so that we can better type check when we're passing information throughout our application. All right, guys, so we're going to continue on our flow. So far, we've looked at props in React. We've looked at state in React. The next thing we're going to be looking at is prop types in React. Prop types, for me anyway, were a bit confusing at the beginning because I didn't really understand what their purpose was. But as I kind of looked into it a bit further, I realized how useful prop types really are. So we're going to run through a few examples to understand what prop types are and how they can be used and also how they can be helpful to you in your development. So the next thing we're going to want to do is create another file, and where this one will be called React PropTypes.js. And again, we're going to go through the same motions as we have previously. So we're going to import React from our React library. And then we are going to create our functional component. So this will be function React prop types. And then we'll just return some JSX once again. So same thing we've been doing. We'll say here, this is my prop types component. We'll save that. Now, the next thing we want to do is make sure, again, we export this component out of our file. And then we'll want to go into our main app.js and import it, of course. And then we will render it. All right, so when we see our header displaying here, that's how we know everything's working as it should be. So in order to use React props within our project, we actually need to install it as an NPM package. So before we get going here, we're gonna have to go back into our command line. I'll kill this server real quick. So Control C will turn your dev server off. And we're going to go npm install -- save prop -types. Oh, don't want to spell that wrong. And then we'll run that and let that run its course. All right, so now that we have waited out the installation of the PropTypes NPM package, we are ready to continue. So before we actually go ahead, I just want to go quickly into our package JSON file here. And I want to show you guys where the PropTypes package lives. So here is where you'll see PropTypes as a package that has been included in our dev dependencies. So whenever you do install NPM packages, you can check your package JSON file down here, which will basically show you that it's been installed. It'll confirm for you that it's there. So as long as you see the name of your package here and its version within your dependencies, then you'll know that it's been successfully installed. You can also check that once the installation has finished running, but this is just an additional check for those of you who may not have been aware. So we're now going to continue, and we're going to go back into our React PropTypes file. And what we're going to do is we're going to import the PropTypes object from our PropTypes library. So down here, we go import PropTypes from prop-types. And then we'll save that. Now, before we can actually define prop types, we actually need to have props to type check. And just a little word on prop types in React. The way prop types are useful for us in React is that they serve as a type check on the props that we pass around within our React application. So the thing with React is because we're using plain old JavaScript in React, JavaScript itself is a language that is dynamically typed. So we don't really have a way to type check when we're writing our code. The type of our data that we use in JavaScript, or the variables that we declare in JavaScript, those types aren't determined until runtime. So all this time when we're declaring array types, objects, strings, we don't actually have a way to check any of that without the use of some sort of type check. Unlike in languages like C# or Java, where the type checking is initialized rather than run at runtime. So what we're going to do is we're going to use destructuring syntax to pass in some props. We'll pass in a first name prop, a last name prop. We can pass in an age and a favorite color. All right, and what we'll now do is we'll just create a table. So this is just going to be a basic HTML table. We'll have a heading. And we'll have our header title. So first name, and I'll just copy and paste this a few times. I believe that was 4, yep. And then we'll change some of these titles here. So last name, and this will be our age. And then this will be our favorite color. And we'll save that. So now notice here we have our header titles. And then the next thing we're going to do is actually create a body for our table. So I'll just copy and paste the headings, and we'll just change these to T body and T body for our closing tag. And then instead of these headings, these will be data points. So TD, TD. I'll just copy and paste that. There we go. So now we're going to switch out these title labels for our props. So the first prop that we'll display will be the first name prop. And then the next one will be our last name prop. Then we'll just say, display a prop for our age. And then one for our favorite color. And now that we save all that, we're not going to see any information displaying here just yet because we haven't actually provided any information to our React component. So the next thing we're going to want to do is go back into our root app component, and we can pass in some props as information. So what we can do is pass in a first name prop as, I'll use my name again, then a last name prop, and we'll pass in an age, and then we'll pass in a favorite color. We'll make this an array. All right, so there we have our information displaying as normal. The array doesn't look too pretty, but it's still there. So now what we can do is we are now ready to perform a type check on our prop types. So we're going to go into our React prop types file, and we're going to declare some prop types at the bottom of the file. So the way in which we do that is we take the name of our component, which is React prop types, and we then will say React prop types dot prop types and set it equal to an object. And within this object will be some key value pairs representing our props and then the types of those props. So first we'll put in a first name key, and the value of that will be our prop types object, and we'll make that a string. And then our last name will be our prop types object, and we'll make that a string as well. And then our age, we'll make that a number. And then our favorite color, we'll make that an array. Now this doesn't change anything within our project. Everything's still rendering the way it was before, but now under the hood there are checks being performed on all of the prop types that we pass with respect to this component. So let's say we decided to go back into our main app component, and instead of a number for 15, we took that number out and we passed in a string of 15. When I save that and we go into our console, we get a warning that tells us that we've failed the prop type validation. So failed prop type, invalid prop of age, of type string, supplied to React prop types, expected a number. What it's doing now within our application is it's going over all of the props that we pass into our prop types component, and it's performing a check against the prop types that we defined just a moment ago. So it goes into the age prop and it says, I'm supposed to get a number for this prop, but instead I got a string for this prop. That's not right. And then it'll throw you a warning that tells you what's wrong. If we didn't use prop types as a type check within our React application, we could possibly pass down incorrect props and we wouldn't really know a way to identify that, because since JavaScript, once again, is a dynamically typed language, it doesn't really give us a way out of the box to check for types. That's where the PropTypes library becomes so incredibly useful. So what we'll do is we'll change this back to a number of 15. And when we save that, it goes back to normal. Our warning is gone. Now, let's say we didn't always receive all the information we were supposed to for this table. We have a first name, last name, age, and favorite color as our headers, but sometimes when we get data, something might be missing. So let's say if we saw here that a first name was missing. Perhaps in some of the data that we were going over, we didn't receive a first name. If I take away my first name and I save, that just means that that column ends up being blank. Now, if you're trying to display this data for the purpose of some end user to be able to use it for something, having simply missing data isn't always what you want the end user to see. You want there to be something in place of that data should it go missing. So what we're going to do within our React prop types component is we're going to make use of default props to make sure that there's always a fallback for our prop in case we don't receive it from whatever API or manual repository that we're supposed to be getting our information from. So what we'll do is we will define the name of our component. And this time we'll say default props, and we'll set that equal to an object. And inside of this object now, we're going to take in the prop types that we want to have as fallbacks. So I'll do first name and last name, and within this value, instead of prop types.string, we're going to set a hard-coded value that is going to represent the fallback or default value in case we don't receive a prop being passed in for first name and last name. So I'll just say that this default will be Katie as a first name, and then default last name will be Jones. And we'll save that. So notice here how as soon as I saved it, it refreshed and Katie printed as the first name in the absence of Valerie. Now, if I went back into my main app component here and I took away my last name as well, and I saved, then Jones becomes the default last name instead of Osei because I took that away. So default prop types can be very helpful if you want to have a fallback in the event that you don't have information being passed in for your prop. Now, another thing we can do with prop types is we can set a required, we can set something as required. So since we already have a default prop for our first and last name, we can go down to our age. And if we add a dot and say is required, then that means that at all times when we are rendering this component, we need to have an age and a favorite color passed in. If we don't, we'll see what happens. So let's go into our main app component. And if I take away my age and favorite color props and I save that, we're going to get another set of warnings. And the first warning here, failed prop type. The prop age is marked as required in React prop types, but its value is undefined. So basically what that means is, again, we're doing another type check against our props, and it's being seen here that there is no age or favorite color prop being passed down to our React prop types component. So that is when the console will warn us and say, you're missing these props, but they're supposed to be there. So maybe you want to put something there. So what we'll do is we'll replace what we took away. And when we save that, our warning goes away. One more thing we can do here is, let's say we only wanted one favorite color. I'm going to take away that array and I'll just pass in a string of blue. And we kind of already know what's going to happen here, right? So we failed our prop type validation because we have a string and we expected an array. So what I can do in that case is just wrap this around a set of curly braces and then around a set of square braces or square brackets and save that. And then we end up passing our prop types validation. So the general rule of thumb with prop types is that if you have default props for certain props in your React component, you don't need to set those as is required because that's basically redundant. If you are required to provide a prop to a component, then there is no reason to have a default or a fallback because the expectation is that you are always going to provide information for that prop type. But if you set a prop type within your default props, you don't need that prop type to be is required because the expectation is that if you don't receive a first name or last name prop, no worries, there is going to be a fallback available. So these are just a few of the things that prop types can provide to us when we want to perform type checks within our React components. Another thing to keep in mind is that for every component, you need to set prop type checking separately for those components. So these prop types won't work outside of this React prop types component. I've only set prop types within this component, so they will only apply to the props being passed into this component. But I can of course decide to go into my React props and I can take my title, name, and age and I can set prop types for those props as well, but that would have to be done within my React props component separately from my React prop types component. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Next thing I'm going to do is just provide a quick summary of all of the concepts we've gone through today. And if you do have any questions about some of the stuff we've done, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm more than happy to address any uncertainties or questions you guys might have. All right, guys, so we have reached the end of this tutorial on props, state, and React prop types, but I just want to go over a really quick summary of what we covered in this tutorial. So we talked about React props and we basically gained understanding on what they are. React props are basically information or data that are passed to our components. So they represent properties which we can set ourselves, things like name, date, age, anything that we want to be able to access as information. These data or information flow from parent to child in a unidirectional data flow, so in one direction downward. We also covered React State through the useState hook because we were only using functional components in this tutorial. But basically, state is managed locally within our component, and it can be used to handle or manage changes to the data within our component. So between React props and state, one major difference is that props are passed to a component. So a component, or in this case, a child component, receives props, whereas when it comes to state, a component has state managed locally inside of it. React prop types were another concept that we looked at, and basically prop types serve as a type check on the props that we pass to our components within our React application. And they are also very useful because they allow us to easily debug our applications, and we can also identify invalid prop types, which will prevent unwanted behavior down the line. We have the option of setting default and required prop types, and this ends up becoming very useful for the purpose of consistency within your React applications and makes debugging, once again, a lot easier. So just as a final note, both React State and props are just plain old JavaScript objects. This is very important to remember. These objects affect the output of our components, and they are often used together to create complex UIs, but they are responsible for different things. So just remember, as I had previously mentioned, React props are responsible for handling the flow of data. So when you have information that you want to be able to access in your React application and render in your React application as output, React props are typically the way in which you're going to do that. State in React is what you're going to use to handle the changes within your React components. So if you do have props being passed to your React component, that those properties or props are not able to be updated directly by a React component. In order to make changes, you will have to manage that through your state. So props and state are used to work together, but they are responsible for different things. So I hope that makes sense. Once again, I open the floor for questions. If you guys do have any, I'm more than happy to start conversations on anything interesting. And I really appreciate you joining me for this tutorial. Thanks so much. Alright guys, so that concludes the video. I really appreciate you joining me and I hope you enjoyed learning with me. If you're looking for more material like this, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or suggestions for me, feel free to leave those in the comments. Also, if you have any friends who are curious to learn how to code, feel free to share this video with them. I'm hoping it'll bring them some joy. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.